Hi everyone, this is Laurel McCombs from the Osborne Group. I want to thank you for joining me today on our webinar, Creating and Implementing an Effective Development Plan. Hopefully you all saw the blog posts that Bob and I posted in the last couple of months about this very important topic, and this is what kind of drove you to join me today. We have a lot of information to go through. I am going to pause for some questions. You'll see in your menu that there is a questions box. If at any point in time you have any questions, please submit your question via the box. I will try to stop a couple of times and answer any questions that come through. Please know that if I don't get a chance to answer your question during the webinar today, I will collect those questions and follow up with you after the webinar today and make sure that any questions you have get answered. So thank you again for joining me. I wanted to go through what we're hoping to accomplish today in our agenda. First and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about why planning is so critical. And this might seem like an obvious question, but the reality is very few organizations, or at least few enough, have a solid, well-written, thoughtful fund development plan in place that I don't think that this is a dumb question. I think that for a lot of us, this is a challenge. Planning is something that isn't a priority, isn't something that takes center stage. I want to talk a little bit about why it should. We're going to talk about some of the planning phases and steps that you need to go through. We're going to talk about elements of a successful plan. And then finally, what I think is perhaps the most important thing we're going to talk about today, which is effective implementation. Because as you all know, a really well-written plan that is never implemented is fairly worthless. And so what I don't want is for all of you to get really great ideas on your plan and then not be able to implement it. So I'm going to start out with a little poll, and I'm going to launch this poll, and I'd love to just hear from those of you who are on the call what the state of your current fund development plan is. So is it pretty well developed and with some good implementation steps in place? Is it have a pretty good start, but we really need to take it to the next level? Are you pretty much just looking at revenue goals? This is something that I see a lot of organizations. I say, what's your fund development plan? And they say, well, we have to raise X number of dollars in each of these revenue streams. Or is it just kind of non-existent right now? So I'm going to give everybody a chance to vote on that. Just leave that open for about 5 more seconds if you haven't had a chance to get your vote in. Okay, 3. Oh, still got some people voting. 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to close the poll and share those results with all of you. So it's actually really nice to see that all of you that at least half of you feel like you have a pretty good start. And so hopefully today is going to give you that last little bit that you need to kind of round out your plan, make sure that you have all of the key elements you need and are really moving forward with implementation. You know, obviously those of you who are kind of in the just identifying revenue goals and don't have a plan at all, hopefully today's call is also really helpful to you in getting started and really filling out those gaps and pushing you forward. So why plan? Why is this so important? For those of you who read my blog post last month, you'll remember that I referenced a study that was done a few months ago, that was published a few months ago in the Stanford Social Innovation Review by Heather Yandow of Third Space Studio. And she studied small nonprofits, just 29 small nonprofits. And she had gone into this thinking that the biggest predictor of success had to be something like the board. It had to be something like how well the board was put together or how advanced the staff were. She had all these preconceived ideas about what it was that was going to be the biggest predictor of success. And what she found after really deeply studying these nonprofits was that the clearest predictor of success was whether or not that organization had a formal fundraising plan in place. And, that plan took on many forms in those organizations. Some, it was just an annual calendar. For others, it was, a set of strategies along their revenue streams. But whatever it is, those organizations that had actually taken the time to have a written plan in place were far more successful than those who didn't. So we know that planning is incredibly important. And as the New Age author Carlos Castaneda said, the trick is what one emphasizes. We either make ourselves miserable or we make ourselves happy. The amount of work is the same. And, I have a lot of people that come to me and say, when I talk with people about why they are or aren't spending time on planning and evaluation, a lot of people will say things like, well, gosh, Laurel, I just don't have time for this. Where am I supposed to find the time to stop everything I'm doing and create a plan? But really, do you have time to spin your wheels? Do you have time to, chase false leads? This is the reality when we don't have a really well-written and thoughtful plan in place, is that we end up wasting far more time than if we had a plan. So, as Castaneda says, we can either make ourselves miserable or we can make ourselves happy. The amount of work is the same. And so keep that in mind as when you're having some of the pains that go with prioritizing planning and carving out time to do a good plan. When you're experiencing some of that, I encourage you to keep this quote in mind and realize that having that plan in place and having those implementation steps in place is going to make you a lot happier, and it's going to make your life a lot better. It's going to help you to achieve a lot of these planning benefits that we talk about. Having a clear and focused approach, knowing where you're going. The bottom line is that in life, I typically, I like a little adventure. I like a little change. I like to sometimes have the fear of the unknown. It kind of is what keeps things fresh. But the reality is, to stay sane, I need to know where I'm going. I need to know how I'm getting there, and I need to know how far along I am. You think about a long road trip, and you would plan out your route. You would think about where you're going. You would stop to see how far you are and how much more time you have left. And you would be checking along the way, what are the weather conditions? Do I need to change my route? Is this not the best way? Is there, unexpected detours and road construction up ahead that makes me realize that I need to change some of my direction? And without having a plan to start with, making course corrections becomes really difficult. I'm going to talk about course corrections farther down in the webinar today, but, without a good plan in place to begin with, it becomes really hard to then shift our plans, right? It helps us make sure we're making informed choices and allocate resources effectively. The biggest benefit, I think, from a personal standpoint, obviously these are all really important things for you organizationally. For me personally, having been in your shoes, having been a practitioner, raising money, having a budget that needed to be met, the biggest thing for me is I want to sleep at night. Our jobs are hard. Development is hard. It is, there's a reason why there's a lot of turnover in this industry. There's a reason why there's a lot of stress in this industry. We carry a lot on our shoulders as development officers, and to have a plan in place and to have an idea of where we're going and how we're going to get there is part of what helps keep us sane as development officers. And so I think, if for nothing else, then the purely selfish reason of not driving yourselves crazy, have a plan in place and have some of the things we're going to be talking about today in place, so that when you go to bed tonight and you have that twinge that I know you all get right as you're starting to fall asleep, and there's that little twinge that you get in your gut that says, oh my gosh, where are we in terms of hitting our foundation goal this year? Or I can't think of where we are. Know that when you get up in the morning, you're going to go check your plan, you're going to go check your table of gifts, and you're not going to know exactly where you are, and you're going to know exactly what you need to do to hit your goal. So, again, whether it's organizational sanity or personal sanity, planning is really critical to that sanity, and I hope that it's something that you all will implement. But of course, a big reason why we don't implement plans, a big reason why planning tends to be something that is shoved off to the side, is because of culture. So often we think of culture and planning as two very different things, but the reality is that our culture often dictates how we plan and the way that plans are viewed within our organizations. And this is something, we talk a lot about culture of philanthropy and how important that is to achieving our philanthropic goals, to achieving our development goals across our organizations. We talk a lot in this industry about, why we have to make sure that everybody in our organization understands philanthropy and really buys into a culture of philanthropy. But we don't talk a lot about being a data-driven culture. We tend to kind of shy away from some of that. And I think we're seeing it more and more, obviously, as more organizations have more sophisticated systems in place to be able to collect and analyze data. As we're realizing that data plays a really critical role in our success. And we need to be able to be taking data and using that data to drive our goals, which is driving our strategies, and then ultimately looking at results. And good, bad, or ugly, being able to look at those results and assess where we need to go. I talked to some organizations. Data can be scary because it uncovers everything, right? Warts and all, here we are. Like I said, good, bad, and ugly. Data is going to tell the story of what's going on, and that can be scary for some staff, and that can be scary for some people who haven't lived in a culture like that. But the reality is the culture we're living in without being data-driven is one where we're making decisions based on gut instincts, based on guesstimates. We're making really critical decisions about how we're going to spend our time and how we're going to allocate our organization's resources based on inferences and guesses, and that's not effective. We have to use data. Yes, you all have really good gut instincts, and that's part of why you're really great development officers, but we have to support those really great gut instincts with really accurate and sophisticated data and let that drive our goals and strategies. So, as you're thinking about some of the barriers and challenges that your organization has to implementing a good plan and really sticking to it, think about your culture and think about if there's a need to take a step back and talk within your whole organization about the role that data plays in driving your goals and your strategies and how you're using that to then assess your results and improve yourselves. So something really important to take into consideration. So before we get into the planning phases and processes, I want to just set the stage. And there's a few really basic things that I think we need to realize, because again, there's a reason this is a challenge. And I've worked with a lot of organizations over the years from all over the country, big, small, big staff, small staff, lots of resources, very few resources, you name it. And I've kind of seen the gamut of organizations. And across the board, whether you're small or whether you're huge. I know some of you on this call are tiny, tiny shops. It might just be you and maybe a couple of other staff people in your whole organization. And others of you on this call are from large universities with big staffs and very sophisticated systems and processes. But regardless, I've seen planning be a challenge for all of you. And there's a reason for that. Again, we've talked about some of that already, but I think it's important for us to remember some really basic things to make sure our planning is successful and making sure our implementation of that plan is successful. And first and foremost, we have to carve out the time. We can't have a great plan and we can't implement that plan effectively if we don't carve out time to make it happen. This has to become a priority for you. And, going back to good old Carlos Castaneda, again, when you think about how you're spending your time now versus how you might spend your time if you carved out the time necessary to do really effective planning, hopefully you see a brighter future with some planning time carved in. So make this a priority, put it on your calendar, put it on your staff's calendar, put it on your CEO's calendar. Make sure that everybody in the organization is carving out time to make this a priority. And give your stakeholders a say. We're going to talk a little bit later about the board, but again, make sure that, planning shouldn't be something that you're going into your office and closing the door and hoping that it all works out in the end. You want to make sure that you're getting everyone involved, that you're getting everybody involved, who needs to be involved. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail later when we talk about having a planning retreat. But stakeholders are vital, and really putting in some time to think about who your stakeholders are is really important. Recognize change management needs. We talked about that a little bit in the last slide, that this isn't just about putting something on a piece of paper and then kind of putting it out into the world and expecting it to happen. This is not an if you build it, it will come kind of thing, right? You don't just write a plan and then suddenly your whole world changes. You have to recognize that planning in and of itself probably is going to require some change management within your organization, and implementation of that plan is going to take a lot of change management. So recognize those needs and plan for them, and figure out how you're going to address them, both in terms of from a process and a system standpoint, but also, like we talked about before, from a cultural standpoint. Recognize that your plan is a dynamic management tool. Again, it's not something to sit on a shelf. It's not something that we do purely because Laurel said it was a good idea, right? I've worked for large national organizations where it was part of the affiliate requirement, right? To be an affiliate of the national organization, you had to have a fund development plan in place. And while that was great, it also meant that a lot of people only had a fund development plan in place for that reason. They didn't use it as a management tool. They purely used it to check off a box to say, yes, we fulfilled this requirement. And that is not what we want planning to be. And remember, again, we're going to talk about implementation at the end of this call, but finishing the plan is just the beginning. This is about how we make planning and evaluation part of our core, part of how we view our work every single day. So let's talk about the planning phases and steps, and I'm going to go through these in more detail as we go through the webinar, but I want to kind of show you the big picture before we dive into this in more detail. First and foremost, getting started. We've got to agree on a process, figure out how we're going to do this, who's going to be on the team, identify, when we talked about constituencies and stakeholders, what's the role of the board? When we talk about constituencies and stakeholders, a lot of times we think just about our team, just about our staff, but I think the board has a really critical role to play in planning, and they have a really critical role to play in all three phases of this. As you're identifying your constituencies and stakeholders, I want you to also think about what their roles are in this, and do you have board members who are going to play a role in actually developing your fund development plan, or is this more about them just understanding and internalizing your fund development plan? The board plays such a critical role in terms of implementation of our fund development strategies. To not include them in this process can be a big miss. Obviously we're going to talk about some of the building blocks to our plan, which is vision, mission, strategic plan, and the board plays a critical role in those. That's something that I think we all know, because it's very clearly something that's part of their role. But then suddenly we kind of get to the fund development plan, to that operational 1-year plan, and we feel like we need to go off with staff and kind of do that, and I actually tend to see very few staff sharing the plan in its entirety with the board, and one of the challenges that comes with that is that the board doesn't understand the complexity of everything that you have to do this year. One of the things that I always talk about with planning is that a good plan tells us as much about what we're going to do as what we're not going to do. And I mentioned this in my blog post last month, that so often, everyone, and bless them, everyone has really great ideas for how we should be doing this work. And I always appreciate in people's enthusiasm, particularly our volunteers, particularly our board members. I'm always thankful for their enthusiasm, but sometimes their enthusiasm can translate into rabbit holes, right? I mean, we've all kind of had that experience of having a board member come to us and say, you know what, I just went to a great event this weekend for American Heart Association. We should totally do an event just like that because it was really fun and I bet they raised a lot of money. We should do that too. And sometimes those are really great ideas, and sometimes they lead to really fabulous outcomes. But a lot of times they lead to distraction, and they pull us off of the path that we need to be on. When we don't have a plan in place, it's really easy for us to get pulled down that path. When we have a plan in place that we have already shared with the board, that we have helped them understand and internalize, we can respond to them when they come to us with those really exciting ideas. We can respond and say, you know what, I love your enthusiasm, and I love that you're so excited about raising money for this organization. You'll remember the fund development plan that we shared with you a couple of months ago. I'd love to go back and see how that might fit into our existing priorities for the year. And if it doesn't, we just might not have the capacity to make that happen, but we can definitely review it as we plan for next year. Your plan gives you a way to politely thank people for their enthusiasm while also sharing with them everything you already have on your plate. And that's a really significant thing. So I wanted to pause on that role of the board as we talk about identifying constituencies and stakeholders, because I think it's really a really important part of this process. We want to as we're still getting started, make sure that we're conducting our internal and external research. We want to gather our building blocks, which we're going to discuss in more detail in just a minute. And then think about barriers. I know we want to all be very positive and think that this is all going to go perfectly, but it's important for us up front to talk about barriers. And some of those barriers might be some of that change management work that we talked about. And it's important for us to get that out on the table up front so that as you go into developing the plan, you can really start to address those barriers and make sure that any barriers that you've identified are getting addressed along the way. So that's really important. As we go into actually developing the plan, we're going to go into these in a little more detail here in a minute, but I wanted to outline them here. And then also metrics and evaluation is clearly an important phase. So we have these three big phases, right? Getting started, actually developing our plan, and then implementing a system of follow-up, having metrics and evaluation, and we're going to talk about that in more detail as well. A note about having a planning retreat. A lot of organizations will ask me if they need to have a planning retreat for their fund development retreat. A lot of times when we look at strategic planning, we know that strategic planning can be a really significant time when we want to hold planning retreats. But sometimes for fund development, for operational annual plans, people aren't so sure. So I will just say that I think, there's a lot of upside to having retreats. I've done a couple of staff planning retreats for their fund development plans, and I think they've been really, really successful in terms of creating buy-in amongst the staff, coming up with specific strategies for people. But, it needs to have a specific purpose. Don't just bring people together to kind of talk about broad generalizations, and don't just give people lip service. Make sure that if you're going to bring staff in and to talk about your plan, make sure that you're actually going to follow up on their input, right? And the worst thing is to have everyone sacrifice a day, go off site, have a retreat, feel really good, feel really inspired, feel like you came up with a lot of really great ideas, and then have none of them implemented, right? And then kind of have the leader go off and kind of do their own thing anyway. So make sure that if you're going to have a retreat, it is really focused on some specific outcomes. It offers people the opportunity to buy in and contribute to strategies to those outcomes, and think about when it's best to hold that retreat. So is the input that you want from the stakeholders really high level? Is it that you want input on what your broad objectives should be, or is it that you want to identify the broad objectives and then bring staff in to talk about strategies, specific action steps for how you're going to achieve those big objections and those big audacious goals that you're setting for yourself. So put some thought into it. Don't just kind of hold a retreat for the sake of having a retreat, because they're resource heavy. You're taking people away from a lot of work they need to do. You're spending money on a site and on hopefully some fun stuff, and so make sure that they're useful. But I wanted to kind of give 2 cents about the retreat. So as we jump into actually putting our plan together. I think it's important that we start with the building blocks, and this was part of our getting started phase, was pulling these building blocks together. And hopefully these first three things are things that should already be in place before you ever start your fund development plan. And again, this is organizationally a challenge for some people, because there may be a lot of you who are saying to me, from across our computer screens, Laurel, our organization doesn't even have a long-range strategic plan in place. And you're telling me that I need to have that in place before I can do my fund development plan. Now, obviously, if your organization doesn't have a long-range strategic plan in place, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do a fund development plan. It means you should probably push the organization to think about long-range strategic planning while you're implementing your fund development plan. It means that you probably should be coming up with your own long-range goals. If they are not identified within a long-range plan, you can develop your own fund development goals, the 3 to 5 year goals. But ultimately, hopefully all of you have mission and vision, right? This is kind of the core of who we are. Mission is, why we exist in this world, and vision is really that picture of what difference we're making in this world. Why are we even here? And so hopefully mission and vision is something that all of you can, look at the screen right now and nod your head. Yes, Laurel, we do have a mission and vision in place, and I'm going to trust that you're all doing that right now. I would imagine that all of you in some way, shape, or form have a set of values and beliefs. And this takes shape in a lot of different ways in organizations. It might actually be a set of values statements that you have. It might be a set of belief statements that your organization has pulled together. It might, again, take some other form. But I would imagine, those of us in the nonprofit sector, we like to talk about values and beliefs. And I would imagine that all of you have some set of values and beliefs. And this might, again, also be something that's about culture of philanthropy and the value that you put on philanthropy across your organization. And then having your strategic business plan in place, and then your fund development. And then, of course, from there, we're going to start building the fund development plan. So what is in our fund development plan? Obviously, again, vision for the future and strategic direction. We want to make sure that we're including this. I want to highlight for all of you, if you haven't noticed it already, there is a handout that you can download right here and now. And I've actually provided you with a template for a fund development plan. This is always the thing I get asked for. Kind of go through philosophy and theory and why we want to include certain things. And the question I always get is, well, do you have a template? So I wanted to make sure you all have to add a template available. And you can kind of follow along if you want. You can also just go back and look at it later. But for those of you who are able to download it now, you can open that up and follow along with that as I go through some of these components of what should be in that plan. And this should follow along pretty well with that. If any of you are unable to download that template, if you're having, I know I've had some people have just challenges with this system and getting the downloads, but it is under the section called handouts, and it's called development plan template. Again, if you're having any trouble, just please email me. I'll provide my email at the end of this session. Please email me and I can just email it to you if you're having any trouble finding that. So first and foremost, we want to make sure that our plan includes our vision for the future, a mission statement, and our strategic direction. Now, don't include your entire strategic direction. We don't need to, have the whole thing there, but I would pull out of your long-range strategic plan anything that is related to philanthropy, anything that's related to your philanthropic goals. Make sure, I like to include that in the plan itself because I think it gives context. I think it's really good for people who are reading your plan for the first time to see how your plan is kind of being driven by your broader vision and by your long-range goals. And I think it's important for those of you who are implementing it even on a day-to-day basis to be able to look at how the things you're doing every single day are contributing to a much bigger picture. The next thing I think it's really important, we want to talk about fundraising priorities in your case for support. Now, of course, we could all spend a week talking about case for support. I mean, it's such a critical tool. It's such a critical piece of our puzzle of making sure that we have success. I don't have time to do that today, and it's really not the point today. But include your case for support in your fund development plan. And again, if you have a 20-page case for support, if you have a 10-page case for support, maybe you don't include it in its entirety, but pull out the key highlights of your case and your fundraising priorities. So what are the things that you've highlighted in your case for support as your current kind of urgent needs for the organization that you're really that are really priorities in terms of finding funding, and what you're talking to donors about. Again, if you have a 10-page case for support, don't include the whole thing in your plan, but pull out the highlights so that, again, as people are enacting the strategies that we're going to talk about in their plan, they're doing it with context. That's part of the challenge we have as development officers, is that we get so wrapped up in minutia every day. We're following up, we're making phone calls, we're scheduling meetings, we're signing contracts, we're doing all of this really detailed work. It's really easy to get trapped, the old, can't see the forest from the trees, that, sometimes we get so mired in the minutia of the day-to-day detail of our work, we forget, kind of what the bigger picture is. What is it that we're doing all of this for? Kind of what's the context? And so including your vision, including your strategic direction, and including your fundraising priorities and case for support helps to really anchor your plan in that context of the bigger picture. What are we trying to achieve? What's different because this organization exists, and how are we kind of moving forward with that? You also want to make sure you have your table of gifts. Again, I feel like I could have a whole webinar just about table of gifts, but hopefully you all have some gift table in place. If you don't, you should. Again, probably one of the most important management tools that you can have in place. Talk about sleeping at night, right? Table of gifts is that thing that, it shows us exactly where we are, shows us exactly what we need, and helps us identify how we're going to get there. So if you don't have a table of gifts in place, please include one in your planning process and include it in your plan. If any of you need help developing a table of gifts, or you want some templates or anything like that, please get in touch with me. I'm happy to share some of that. But again, I won't go into a lot of detail about a table of gifts, except to say it has to be part of your plan, and it is a really vital tool that you're going to be implementing to know where you're going. And as you go into developing your action items and your strategies within your plan, your table of gifts dictates that. If I don't know how many gifts I need at different levels, how do I know what strategies I should even implement, right? If I don't know that I need 4 gifts at $50,000 and that's going to require 12 to 16 prospects, how do I even know what strategies I should implement? How do I even know how many visits I should be making a month? How do I even know, how, when I go to the board and ask them to identify prospects and open doors for me, if I don't have a table of gifts in place, how do I even know what doors I need opened? So again, it's such a critical part of developing our strategy, developing our plan. So I wanted to make sure that I highlighted that. I'm going to stop for just a second here and look and see if I have any questions. It does look like I've got a few questions here. How do you quantify with data engagement, i.e. a potential donor's engagement evolution with an organization? Barbara, that is such a great question, and not one that I feel like I could have a philosophical discussion with you about for days, which I'm not going to do here and now. There are some metrics that we talk about, some really interesting metrics around. One of the ones that Karen Osborne likes to talk a lot about is E-scores, engagement scores, where you can actually assign a value to your various engagement activities, and then as different donors are engaging in those activities, you're kind of giving that score to them, and then over time you can look at their E-score to see gosh, are they at a 50 or are they at a 10? So how it's a really great way to quantify engagement. So we know that attending a donor thank you reception is probably a higher level of engagement than, say, reading getting a postcard in the mail. So getting a postcard might be ranked 1. Attending a thank you event in person might be 5. And then over time, you're able to see so that's one way we like to quantify it. I am going to talk a little bit later about a webinar that I did last year around metrics. I really encourage you to go to our blog and check out that metrics webinar, because I think I go into a little bit more detail about how we can start to assign metrics to various stages of the donor management process, which hopefully will get to your question. Barbara, if I didn't answer that effectively, please get in touch with me later. Will this presentation be available for us to save? It is not available for you to save from here. You will get a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar if you want to share the recording with anyone else in your organization. If you are interested in a PDF of the slides, please email me and I will email you that PDF after this. So anybody who wants a copy of these slides. I've begun my strategic planning and have it delineated by month-to-month activities, but those activities are to raise funds, not build a culture of philanthropy. Should I have a separate SP for training and building a culture of philanthropy? Is there a way to combine the two, or is that a bad idea? I want to plan well, but my SP involves tasks to reach financial goals, but I have nothing built or layered out for development or culture of philanthropy. Jessica, that's a really great question, and I actually am going to be addressing that in just a minute. I think our plans need to be multifaceted, and I think we do need to be going kind of beyond just talking about revenue tactics and talking about cultural things. I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts around including technology and infrastructure, staffing and human resources. Culture of philanthropy, I think, is part of that, because ultimately it's not different, right? Training and building a culture of philanthropy, the role that plays in your ultimate success and the role that plays in your ability to reach your financial goals is significant. So, we don't want to have separate plans that address culture versus address tactics, because ultimately it's all in the mix. Building a culture of philanthropy and knowing that you have a CEO and a board and program staff and that everyone in the organization is ready, willing, and able to serve in their appropriate role as it relates to philanthropy is such a critical component of your success and such a critical part of you enacting those kind of tasks that you're laying out to achieve your financial goals. I think it all needs to be in one place. And Suzanne, you asked about the template. Hopefully you found that in the handout section. If you have multiple campaigns, would you have a separate table of gifts listed? Tesha, great question. Absolutely. And I actually, again, if anybody wants a sample table of gifts, I did not include that as a handout here. I probably should have, but you can email me. I have a sample template where I actually have separate tabs for where you have an overall table of gifts, and then you have a breakdown by revenue source you could break it down by individual giving, corporate, foundation. You could do it by event, whatever works best for you in terms of how you look at your revenue streams. But I do recommend breaking that table of gifts down. Have an overall table so you kind of have a sense of the big picture, but also, once you get into your name by name table of gifts, I do absolutely recommend breaking that down by revenue source or by fundraising activity, whichever kind of works better. Given the requirements for a development department to raise their salaries and operating budgets, how would you write a development plan for a new development office? Michelle, really good question. Again, I think developing your plan is about, when you look at the template that I've given you, and actually I'm going to use this is a really great segue back into the slides. As you look at the template, once we've kind of gone through our high-level stuff, I'm going to jump into the more detailed stuff now. when we start to identify our measurable overall goals and objectives, I think it's important that we make sure that we know what those goal areas are. Now, if you're a new shop, might look very different than if you're a more tenured shop, right? But ultimately, we want to look at what we need to accomplish our vision. What is it that we're accomplishing? And that means revenue. So I have here that it's more than revenue, but yes, first and foremost, it's revenue. So, in that plan, you need to lay out what your revenue goals are and what they are by revenue source so that you have a sense of, that's the bottom line ultimately, is we have to hit our goals. We have to raise that money. And so we want to make sure that that's front and center in our plan, but also make sure that you're identifying other goals within that. As you look at your goal areas, which I have here on the left, these are kind of the primary goal areas. Some of you may have other things, especially if your shops are more combined shops. We do have a section for communications and marketing plan in this, but you might have communications and marketing take a more front and center role. Some of you may have fee for service projects that you run that need to be part of this plan. But for the most part, we want to make sure that we're looking at individual giving. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. Planned giving, if that is in fact something that your organization is looking at, I think it's really important that you have a goal area around planned giving. Events, love it or hate it, it's a part of our lives for most of us. Corporate and foundations, government, and then make sure, and this kind of gets to the question about, do we include goals beyond just the tasks for revenue streams? Do we include some of those culture of philanthropy type goals? I think you should have a section for board and volunteers. Again, you might have different objectives for board versus if you have some other volunteers, committee members, other development volunteers. You should identify some objectives around your staff and human resources, and then finally technology and infrastructure. It's important that you're addressing all of this in your plan, and ultimately this is all building to achieving your revenue goals and achieving the goals that have been set out in your long-range strategic plan. Some of you will have 3 to 5 year goals around, let's say, lessening your reliance on special events. That's something that I hear a lot from organizations. Well, that doesn't happen just because we close our eyes and cross our fingers and wish really hard, right? We don't lessen our reliance on special events without a very detailed and tactical plan of attack. And this is where we start to get into that plan of attack. And it may be a 3 to 5 year goal, but that doesn't mean we wait until year 5 to make it happen. We have to be making measurable progress along the way. And this is where we start to do that. We start to identify objectives that are beyond just how much money I need to raise through special events, but we may also have an additional objective that says, that we want to be cultivating event participants and donors so that they become non-event donors, right? There might be a specific objective around that then we create some action items around. So once we've identified our goal areas, and you'll see in the template that I gave you, these are kind of the goal areas that I've included there. I actually don't think I have government funding in that template, but of course you can always add it. But once we've identified our goal areas and our broad objectives within those goal areas, again, whether it's revenue related or whether it's non-revenue related, now we need to come up with the action steps for achieving this. And Bob, hopefully a lot of you read Bob's blog post that he put up last week. And, I loved one of the things he said is you've got to be specific. I do see so many plans where people say things like, increase the number of people that are coming to an event, or, improve our culture of philanthropy. They say these kind of really broad goals, right? But without any real meat about how you're going to get there. People will, and even saying something about, we need to raise $500,000 from foundations this year. That's great. And that's a good objective. And, when we're up here talking about goals and objectives, absolutely, that is your objective. You need to raise $500,000 from foundations this year. But how are you going to get there? What are the specific steps that you need to put in place? And a lot of people will say, well, how detailed does this need to be, Laurel? I think the answer is it needs to be as detailed as you need it to be. That's kind of the total cop-out answer that I have for this. It depends on your team. It depends on how much detail and direction your team needs. If your team is pretty good at taking some broad steps and filling in the blanks, you can leave it fairly broad. Other teams need it all spelled out step by step. You'll see that in the template that I provided you. I've provided just a couple of action step examples in there. Definitely these are just kind of to give you an idea of language, but you should definitely put something in place that gives your team the meat it needs. But don't write War and Peace. Like, we don't need 60-page development plans that say that I'm going to buy coffee on Tuesday so that I'm awake enough for my meeting at 10 o'clock, right? We don't need that level of detail in our fund development plan. But we should talk about, you should talk about things that you're going to do on a monthly basis, things you're going to do on a quarterly basis, talk about major milestones, use benchmark and completion dates, because there are some things that are going to be monthly, some things that are made quarterly, some things that are going to happen just with one date at the end of it. So again, make sure that every action step has a lead, and then make sure, absolutely, that you are looking at metrics. So one of the other things you'll notice in the plan that I provided you is that every objective has, you have an objective listed, you have a set of action items listed, and then you have key success metrics listed for every objective. So every objective, we are looking at how are we going to measure success on this. Again, metrics, I am such a data nerd. I really do encourage you. There's a great webinar that I did last year that you can find on our blog. You can find a link to it on our blog, talking about finding effective metrics and making course corrections. It goes into this in much greater detail. I actually go through the whole donor management process and various aspects of your development program and talk about the metrics that can be most effective for you to implement. But I do have some suggestions in the template I've provided you. But again, find the metrics. Don't, create a metric system that is impossible for you to follow up on. Make sure that they are metrics that you can measure. There are things that you have the ability to measure, and that will actually help you see whether or not you're achieving your goals. So, look at your objective, look at the action steps that you've put in place, and then choose metrics that are actually going to help you to monitor progress. That's the bottom line. Again, what's keeping you up at night? Like, what are the things that are just gnawing at you? And find some ways to measure that so that I mean, gosh, for years and years, thanks to an awful Stephen King book, I was terrified of the boogeyman. I thought he was hiding in my closet. I am not kidding you. Into my 20s, I couldn't sleep with the closet door open, right? And so there are just those times when you have to get up and you have to open the closet door and make sure that the boogeyman's not there. Think about, what's your boogeyman? What are those things that are keeping you up at night? What is it that you need to open the closet door and look at, and make sure that that's what you're measuring on a constant basis. I do just want to make a note. You'll see in the template that I've identified donor management with this 8-step model. I just wanted to highlight that so that as you're going through that template, you're not kind of like, what are these different categories she's used? You'll see that I went into a lot more detail around individual giving than I did on any other topic, and there's a very intentional reason for that. Most 90% of nonprofits that I'm talking to struggle more with individual giving than they do with any other revenue source. It is by far the revenue source that organizations just don't have a handle on, don't have great processes and systems around, and is the thing that they're trying to grow and having the hardest time growing. And, if we really want to make change in a particular area, we need to put focus on that. So that's why in that plan there is such a bigger focus on individual giving. Now, of course, you could take this donor management model and you could apply it to foundations and corporations and government to some extent. You could kind of replicate that within those other revenue streams, absolutely. But I just wanted to let you all know that's kind of why that's in there. Finally, calendar and budget, and I do realize that I'm getting a little short on time, so I want to make sure that I'm going to speed through this last part fairly quickly. Calendar and budget, obvious. Hopefully all of you have this in some shape or form, but it's important to recognize it. Include it in your plan, include them both in your plan, either within the plan body itself or as appendixes. Be realistic about both your calendar and your budget, but be ambitious. Be thorough and be inclusive. And I say that because especially when it comes to our budget, we don't always think about hidden costs like staff time, making sure that we're being inclusive of all costs and of all activities. Make sure that our calendar really is representative of everything that we need to do, not just big events, right? So make sure that our calendar includes meetings, really critical meetings that we have to have internally and externally, making sure that you're including in your calendar time for priorities, for things like, planning, make sure that that's all included there, and use your calendar and your budget as a reality check. A lot of times our calendar and we create this really great plan, and then we go back and we assign resource allocation in our budget, and we start to calendar everything out, and that's when we realize how overambitious we've been in terms of what we've outlined. We realize that we have way too much happening. There's no way we have the capacity to or the time, or we realize that we have created a budget situation that we just can't, that it just isn't realistic. So, make sure your calendar and budget aren't just kind of an afterthought, but they're actually a really core part of your planning, and you're using it to go back as a reality check. So I'm going to spend the next about 6 minutes just talking about effective implementation, because I think it's really important. Again, as I said in the beginning, a really well-written plan, you all could leave here today and go and write just a dynamite plan, and then have it just sit on your computer, have it sit in your hard drive, and never look at it again until the end of the year. And yeah, you will have wasted time. It will have been a waste of time for you to take that time to create a really great plan, because it will have been for nothing. So, we need to make sure that we are putting some implementation steps in place. First and foremost, we need to have regular check-ins. We need to talk about this. And again, this goes back to that whole data-driven culture thing, right? If looking at data and using data to make decisions about where we're going and what strategies we're implementing, if that's part of our DNA, if that's part of who we are, then I think it's really important that we're checking in regularly, that obviously annually we're reviewing and looking at we're looking at the results, how everything went. We're using that assessment and that analysis to kind of create our new plan, and we're also using it to make changes to our long-range strategic plan, right? Long-range strategic plans can be dynamic too. They can be changed and be updated as well. At mid-year, at a minimum, at mid-year, you're looking at data, at metrics, about progress toward goal, and you're making course corrections. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute. And then I think that you should be looking at this monthly. Absolutely, you should have regular meetings that are dedicated to this. You should have reports and metrics that you're looking at on a regular basis. And I'm going to show you an example of a monthly management dashboard in just a minute. But integrate and adapt. So, if you already have a monthly staff meeting, you don't need to have another meeting, but maybe, you change your staff meeting agenda so that, the first 20 minutes is a check-in on this or whatever it might be. If you already have a metrics dashboard that you look at as a team, don't create a separate one for your plan. Just make sure that you're integrating your plan metrics into that existing dashboard. I want to talk a little bit about a tool because I'm going to show you a timeline here in a minute. RASS Keys is a really great tool. Some of you may be familiar with it. Definitely not something that I came up with, but I stole from people much smarter than myself. A really great way to assign ownership and responsibilities. So often we just kind of look at who's the lead on things, but there are different roles that people need to play. So I think it's just a really great tool as you think about how you're going to assign responsibilities and assign roles within your plan. This is just I love this system. Some of you may have other systems that you really love. And so, but I just wanted to share this one and then how that gets incorporated into a timeline. So what I think it's, simple enough as, once you create your fund development plan, all of those action items then get dumped, copied and pasted into a master spreadsheet that then has, objective, action item, due date, and the RASS key. All of the different roles, you're then able to sort and look at it by the objective area. You're able to look at it by due date. You're able to look at it by staff. So I could go in and I could sort this by responsible and look and see what I'm responsible for as a staff member, or sort it by support and see where I'm expected to have some supporting role in different things. So definitely encourage you to create an actual timeline with actual due dates that you can go in and then check mark when you've done it, and make sure that you're checking that off as you go, both because, gosh, I love a sense of satisfaction, the satisfaction I get out of accomplishing a task. I don't know about all of you, but there's nothing I like better in my day than crossing things off my to-do list. So for me, this provides a really visceral sense of satisfaction, but it also just gives you an idea of how far along you are, so that when you check in monthly, you're able to see. If you want to take this to even the next level, and this is where a lot of you are sitting at your desks and like, wow, Laurel is really nerdy. This is even next level. For those of you who are interested in this level of management, what I would recommend is taking your timeline and by month, creating tabs monthly where you're actually, showing again your goal area, the action item, who's responsible, and then every month everyone is going through and they're highlighting red, yellow, green. Green is I did it, yellow is I'm on my way but I'm getting stuck, and red is I haven't even touched it. Right? And everyone is filling that out. They're talking about what follow-up needs to happen, and then you're meeting as a team to talk about what are the challenges we're facing, help people get unstuck. So, in this case, the CDO is having a really hard time, revisiting the agency vision statement, and maybe it's because she really needs to meet with the CEO and she can't get any time on the CEO's calendar. There might be some really specific reasons that people are getting stuck on tasks. A monthly management dashboard helps you to really uncover bottlenecks, where people are getting stuck, and have brainstorming and problem solving discussions as a team to help people get unstuck. And you'll find that it can be as simple as somebody saying, oh my gosh, I actually already did that last month, here you go. Or gosh, I know I have a meeting with the CEO scheduled and it is not a priority. You take my time, whatever it is. So again, I know it can feel like a lot, like some of these different dashboards and reports, but this is if you're having a hard time getting your plan to stick, and if you're having a hard time really making this actionable, these might be the steps that you need to take. And once we do this, we got to make course corrections, because the reality is no matter how good our plan is, no matter how good our dashboards and our reports and our review processes are, we're going to hit a point where things just aren't going how we plan planned. And so I think it's really important that you all feel like you have the ability to make course corrections. You have the freedom to make course corrections. Plans are not etched in stone. They are meant to be dynamic. They are meant to change. They are meant to be nimble. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that every time we don't meet a goal, we just change it because we don't want to look bad. We need to be realistic and honest with ourselves about where we have maybe not done what we needed to do to achieve a particular goal or make progress toward an objective. But, I think, again, making course corrections is a really critical part of this. And, great quote from Stephen Covey, and I'm just going to pause here and take a look at our questions. And it looks like we have a few questions. I'm coming into an old organization that has only recently invested in development. The first DD they've had with experience in development, things have been super haphazard. How do I shape my fund development plan to incorporate needing to clean up these messes before I raise money or as I raise money? And again, Emily, I think that's, again, such a great question that, again, why our fund development plan has to be bigger than just how are we going to hit revenue goals, right? Because all of this is the reality we live with. Hitting our revenue goals is not just about the strategies and action steps that we take, but it's about all of this other stuff that's happening around us. And as you look through that template, I think, recognizing things like having a section for staff and human resources, having a goal area around technology and infrastructure, these are the places where you can set some of those objectives and identify the action steps that are going to need to happen. And then as you pull that into your timeline, this is the other reason I really love pulling your action steps into a timeline, is because it then helps you to see how much is on your plate and helps you to go back and have a reality check and say, some of this needs to come off the plate. How do I prioritize? Until we put everything out there, it's really hard to prioritize. And when we don't have everything out in a written plan, we're kind of prioritizing on the fly, which means we're not prioritizing. It means we're just kind of doing things as we're putting out fires, right? So make sure you get everything out there. And again, Emily, please follow up with me if I didn't answer that very effectively. And I do have a couple of the other questions I'm afraid I'm just not going to have a chance to get to. For those I didn't get to, I will follow up with you after this call and make sure I answer your question. I want to thank you all for joining me today. Here's my email is here. If anybody, again, wants the PDF of today's slides, please email me. If you have any questions or follow-up from today's session, please email me. I think most of you on this call are subscribed to our mailing list, but please check out our blog. As I've mentioned, there's some great blog posts there, as well as some links to past webinars that we've done. And with that, I will say thank you for joining me and have a great rest of your day and best of luck in your planning adventures. Thanks.